What would you do if you found a child lost and alone, stalked by predators? Would you help even if that child belonged to a people your own had sworn to destroy? For a lone woman on the Texas frontier, one act of compassion, saving a Comanche boy from certain death, was not the end of a story, but the beginning of a war. She saved a life, but what came next was a reckoning that would drench the plains in blood and forever change the fate of two worlds. Stick with us as we tell the tale of how one woman's choice brought 100 warriors to her doorstep. The first thing Ruslan O'Malley noticed was the silence. It wasn't the usual quiet of the vast, sun-baked plains of West Texas in the summer of 1871. That was a living sound, a symphony of buzzing insects, the distant cry of a hawk, and the constant whispering song of the wind through the tall buffalo grass. This was a dead silence, a heavy, watchful stillness that pricked the skin and tightened the muscles in her back. The cicadas had ceased their drone. The birds had fallen quiet. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. She stood on the porch of her sodden timber homestead, a shotgun resting loosely in the crook of her arm, her knuckles white where she gripped the weathered wood. Her husband Michael had built this place with his own hands 5 years ago, carving a small patch of hope out of the unforgiving wilderness. He had been a man of deep faith and boundless optimism, convinced that God and hard work could make this land flourish. A year ago, a rattlesnake had proven that the land had its own gods, and they were not always merciful. Now there was only Ruslan, a woman in her late 20s, though the harsh sun and the grief had etched lines around her eyes that made her look older. Her hair, the color of corn silk, was pulled back in a severe bun, and her dress, a practical calico faded from 1,000 washings, was patched at the elbows. She was not a large woman, but she was sinewy and tough, her body honed by the relentless labor of survival. Plowing the small cornfield, tending the chickens, mending the fences, it was a life that left no room for softness. The silence was broken by a sound. It was faint at first, a high-pitched yipping that scraped at the edges of the stillness. Coyotes. But there was something else woven into their hungry calls, a sound that didn't belong, a thin, reedy cry, almost like a lamb's bleating, but with a desperate human edge. Ruslan's eyes narrowed, scanning the rolling expanse of gold and brown that stretched to the horizon. About a quarter-mile out, near a shallow, rock-strewn arroyo, she saw movement. A pack of maybe 6 coyotes, their grey-brown fur, making them almost invisible against the parched earth. They were circling something. Their movements were tight, agitated, darting in and out. And in the center of their circle was the source of that strange cry. Her first instinct, the one honed by a year of solitude, was to ignore it. The prairie had its own brutal logic of predator and prey. Interfering was a fool's game, a quick way to get yourself killed. It was probably just a calf that had wandered from the small herd of her neighbor Jacob Miller, whose homestead was a good 5 miles east. Jacob could handle his own affairs, but the cry came again, sharper this time, laced with a terror that resonated deep in her bones. It wasn't an animal. She was sure of it. Damn it all! She muttered the words, tasting like dust in her mouth. She checked the shotgun, Michael's old double-barreled Remington. It was loaded. Stepping off the porch, she moved with a purpose that belied her inner turmoil. She didn't run. You never ran on the prairie unless you had to. It wasted energy you might need later. She walked her stride, long and steady, the shotgun held ready across her chest. As she drew closer, the scene resolved into horrifying clarity. The coyotes were not circling a calf. In the middle of their hungry dance was a small child, a boy no older than 4 or 5. He was naked, except for a leather breechcloth, his skin the color of polished copper, his black hair long and matted with dirt. A Comanche boy. Ruslan's heart hammered against her ribs. This changed everything. This wasn't just a matter of interfering with nature. This was interfering with man. The settlers around Prairie Creek, the nearest collection of buildings that passed for a town, lived in a state of simmering fear and hatred of the Comanche. They were called the Lords of the Plains, for a reason. They were a proud, fierce people who saw the white homesteaders as invaders, thieves who plowed over their ancestral hunting grounds. Stories of their raids of burning homes, stolen livestock and murdered families were whispered around every campfire and preached from the pulpit of the makeshift church. The name Quanah Parker, the new war chief of the Quahadi Comanche, was spoken like a curse. To the people of Prairie Creek, a Comanche was not a person. It was a menace, a creature to be feared, and if possible, exterminated. Finding a lost child was one thing. Finding a lost Comanche child was another entirely. Helping him would be seen as treason. Leaving him was unthinkable. The lead coyote, a big male with a ragged scar on its muzzle, saw her approaching. It stopped its circling, lowered its head, and let out a low growl, its lips peeling back to reveal yellowed teeth. The others followed its lead, turning their attention from the boy to the new threat. The boy, seeing his chance, scrambled backward, his small face a mask of stoic terror. He didn't cry out anymore. He just watched, his dark eyes wide and unblinking. Ruslan raised the Remington, the metal cool and solid against her shoulder. "Get on now." "Git!" she yelled, her voice hoarse. The lead coyote took a tentative step forward. It was hungry, and it had the advantage of numbers. It thought it could win. She didn't aim to kill. Ammunition was precious. She aimed a few feet to the side of the pack leader and pulled the trigger. The roar of the shotgun was a physical blow, a thunderclap that shattered the silence and sent a cloud of dust and rock into the air. The coyotes, creatures of stealth and cunning, flinched back from the raw power of the blast. The lead male yelped and tucked its tail, and the pack scattered, melting back into the landscape, as if they were never there. The echo of the shot rolled across the prairie and faded, and the silence that returned was even more profound. Ruslan stood there, the smell of gunpowder sharp in her nostrils, her ears ringing. The only two living things in that vast empty space were her and the boy. She slowly lowered the shotgun and walked toward him. He was pressed against a sun-bleached rock, trying to make himself smaller. He had scratches on his arms and legs, and a nasty gash on his cheek where one of the coyotes had gotten too close. He was covered in dirt and trembling, but his eyes held a defiance, a fierce pride that seemed far too large for such a small body. He was a warrior in miniature. "It's all right," she said softly, keeping her voice low and calm. "They're gone. You're safe now." The boy said nothing. He just watched her, his gaze unwavering. He didn't understand a word she was saying, of course. She was the enemy, the other kind. Her white skin, her strange clothes, the thunder stick in her hands, it all marked her as a threat. She took another step, and he flinched, pressing himself harder against the rock. Ruslan stopped. She knew this was a dangerous moment. The boy was lost, separated from his people. If she left him here, he would die. The coyotes would be back, or the sun would kill him, or he'd die of thirst. If she took him in, what then? His tribe would be looking for him. A war party. And when they came, they wouldn't stop to ask questions. They would see her, a white woman with one of their own, and assume the worst. They would assume she was a kidnapper. She thought of the faces of the people in Prairie Creek. She thought of Marshal John Cartwright, a hard man who saw the world in black and white, and to whom the only good Comanche was a dead one. She thought of Jacob Miller, who had lost his brother in a raid 2 years prior. They would not understand this. They would see it as a betrayal. But then she looked at the boy, not as a Comanche, but as a child, a terrified, hurting, lost little boy. She saw the dried tear tracks on his dusty cheeks, the way his small chest hitched with every breath. She saw the gash on his face, beaded with blood. And in that moment, all the politics, all the fear, all the hatred that defined her world seemed to fade away. She knelt, making herself smaller, less threatening. She placed the shotgun on the ground beside her, a gesture of peace. She held out her empty hand, palm up. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I want to help." The boy stared at her hand, then back at her face. He was still trembling, but the fierce defiance in his eyes was now mixed with a flicker of something else. Confusion. Curiosity. Hope. For a long minute he didn't move. The sun beat down on them, and the silence of the prairie wrapped them in its embrace. Then slowly, hesitantly, took a tiny step away from the rock. He did not take her hand, but he did not run. It was enough. Ruslan O'Malley rose to her feet, her decision made. She picked up her shotgun and turned back toward the lonely sod house on the horizon. She did not know if she was saving the boy's life or ending her own. She only knew that she could not leave him to die. With the sun on her back and the lost child trailing a few feet behind her, she walked toward a future she could not possibly imagine, a future that was already riding toward her on the endless, unforgiving plains. The interior of the sod house was cool and dark after the glare of the prairie. It was a simple one-room dwelling, but Ruslan kept it meticulously clean. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs stood in the center, a cast-iron stove in the corner, and a bed with a patchwork quilt was pushed against the far wall. The air smelled of dried herbs, wood smoke, and soap. To Ruslan, it was home. To the boy, it must have seemed like a cave trap. He hesitated at the threshold, a small, wild creature poised for flight. His eyes, wide and dark, darted around the enclosed space, taking in the strange angles and unfamiliar objects. He had followed her all the way from the arroyo, keeping a careful distance of 10 feet, his bare feet making no sound on the hard-packed earth. Now faced with the gaping maw of the doorway, he balked. Ruslan didn't force him. She set the shotgun on its pegs by the door and moved to the water barrel, her movements deliberately slow and unthreatening. She ladled cool, slightly metallic-tasting water into a tin cup and drank from it herself, letting him see that it was safe. Then she refilled the cup and set it on the floor just inside the doorway, before backing away to the far side of the room. She sat on the edge of her bed, her hands folded in her lap, and waited. The silence, stretched, filled only by the ticking of the small mantel clock Michael had insisted on bringing all the way from Ohio. It was a sound that had once comforted her. Now it seemed to count down the seconds to some unknown disaster. Minutes passed. The boy remained silhouetted against the bright rectangle of the doorway. He was watching her, studying her with an unnerving intensity. Finally, driven by a thirst that must have been agonizing, he took a quick, darting step inside, snatched the cup, and retreated back to the relative safety of the porch. Ruslan heard him gulping the water down. A small victory. She spent the next hour in a strange, silent dance with the child. She brought out a bowl of leftover corn stew, still warm from the stove. She set it on the porch along with a piece of cornbread. He waited until she was back inside before he approached the food, eating quickly and ravenously with his hands, his eyes never leaving the doorway. He was like a fox she was trying to tame, accepting her offerings but trusting nothing. The gash on his cheek needed tending. It was inflamed and crusted with dirt. Infection in this land was a death sentence. She found a clean rag and soaked it in a basin of warm water with a bit of lye soap. When she approached the porch, he scrambled to his feet, his body tensed. "Easy now," she murmured, showing him the cloth. "Just want to clean that. It'll feel better." He bared his teeth in a silent snarl. It was pure, unadulterated defiance. Ruslan sighed. She couldn't force him. That would undo the fragile, threadbare trust she had started to build. She set the basin down on the porch steps and retreated once more. She sat at her table, picked up a potato and began to peel it, her hands performing the familiar task automatically. She did not look at him pretending to be absorbed in her work. She could feel his eyes on her. After a long while, she heard a faint splashing sound. Peeking through the window, she saw him tentatively dabbing at his own face with the wet rag. He was clumsy, hissing in pain when the soap stung the cut, but he was doing it. He was a survivor. He understood the need. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, a new kind of fear began to creep into Ruslan's heart. Daylight offered a measure of safety. She could see what was coming. The night was a different matter. The night belonged to things that hunted both animal and human. Every shadow could hold a threat. A Comanche war party could be watching her homestead right now, hidden in the tall grass, waiting for the cover of darkness. She had to get the boy inside. Leaving him on the porch was not an option. She took a different approach. Ignoring him, she began her nightly routine. She brought in the chickens from their coop, securing the latch against predators. She barred the door and shuttered the single window, plunging the sod house into the warm, flickering glow of a single tallow candle. She moved about the room, humming a tuneless, mournful Irish folk song. Michael had loved the melody, a ghost in the small space. She set a lit candle on the floor near the open doorway, its small flame a beacon in the growing twilight. Then she sat on her bed, her back to the door, and simply waited. She didn't look. She didn't speak. She just existed, a calm presence in the heart of the house. She heard a floorboard creak behind her. Her entire body went rigid, but she forced herself to remain still. She heard the soft padding of bare feet on the wooden planks, a faint rustle of movement, then the sound of the door being slowly pushed shut. The thick wooden bar scraped as it was dropped into its brackets. Ruslan let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She turned. The boy was standing by the now barred door, his small hand still resting on the wood. He looked even smaller in the candle-lit gloom, a lost shadow against the heavy timbers. He had made his choice. He had chosen the unknown dangers of her home over the known dangers of the night. He walked silently to the corner farthest from her bed, near the cold stove, and slid down the wall to sit on the floor. He drew his knees up to his chest and wrapped his arms around them. A tiny, defiant island in a sea of strangeness. Ruslan didn't know what to call him. In her mind, she started thinking of him as Taco. It was a simple, short sound, meaningless, but it was better than the boy. It gave him an identity, however temporary. She offered him a blanket, but he refused it with a sharp shake of his head. So she left it on the floor a few feet away from him. She ate her own meager dinner of potato and salted pork in silence, acutely aware of the two dark eyes that followed her every move. When it was time to sleep, she lay down on her bed, fully clothed, the shotgun propped against the wall within arm's reach. She did not expect to sleep, but exhaustion deep and profound claimed her. She fell into a fitful, dream-haunted slumber. She dreamt of Michael, of the feel of his hand in hers. She dreamt of coyotes with human eyes. She dreamt of 100 silent warriors on horseback, their faces painted for war, their lances catching the light of a blood-red moon. She awoke with a gasp, her heart pounding. The candle had burned down to a nub, casting long, dancing shadows. Something was wrong. The air in the room had changed. She reached for the shotgun, her fingers closing around the cold steel of the barrel. Then she saw him. Taco. He was no longer in the corner. He was standing by her bed, looking down at her. In his hand, he held the patchwork quilt, the one she had left on the floor. He hadn't used it for himself. He had, at some point in the night, crept over and draped it over her sleeping form. The gesture was so unexpected, so deeply and simply human, that it shattered the last of her reservations. A wave of emotion, fierce and protective, washed over her. This wasn't about politics or race or fear anymore. This was about this one small lost soul who had shown her a moment of kindness when he had every reason to hate her. The tender moment was broken by the sound of hoofbeats. Not the thundering gallop of a war party, but the steady rhythmic trot of a single horse. It was coming closer. Ruslan was on her feet in an instant, grabbing the shotgun. She peered through a crack in the window shutter. In the pale pre-dawn light, a rider was approaching. A tall man in a dusty coat, a badge glinting on his chest. Marshal John Cartwright. His face, visible even from a distance, was set in its usual grim, uncompromising lines. He rode as if he owned the very land he crossed, his eyes sweeping across the prairie, missing nothing. Ruslan's blood ran cold. The marshal was not a man who paid social calls. His presence meant trouble. He reined in his horse a few yards from the house, his gaze lingering on the porch, on the discarded bowl, and the tin cup on the small, bare footprints in the dust. He knew, or he suspected. She looked at Taco, who had retreated back to his corner, his eyes wide with a fear she now understood completely. The danger was no longer outside. It was here. It had a name and a badge. Marshal Cartwright dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry ground. He didn't call out. He just walked toward the door, his hand resting casually on the butt of the Colt revolver, strapped to his hip. Ruslan's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was trapped. She had barred the door against the monsters of the night, only to find one standing on her doorstep in the morning light. A sharp, authoritative knock rattled the heavy wooden door. It was a sound that expected no refusal. "Mrs. O'Malley. Open this door. Marshal Cartwright." Ruslan's mind raced. Hide him. She had to hide him. But where the one-room sod house offered no closets, no cellars, no hiding places that a man like Cartwright wouldn't find in seconds. Her eyes darted around the room and landed on the bed. It was built high off the floor to keep the sleeper away from the cold ground and any stray critters. The space underneath was dark, shrouded by the hanging edge of the patchwork quilt. She turned to Taco, her face urgent. She put a finger to her lips, then pointed emphatically toward the bed. Underneath. Now. Be quiet. Not a sound, she whispered, knowing the words were meaningless, but hoping her tone conveyed the life-or-death urgency. For a terrifying second, the boy just stared at her, his defiance flaring. He did not know this man, but he knew the scent of danger. Then something in Ruslan's desperate expression must have broken through. He gave a single sharp nod and moved with a fluid silence that was astonishing, slipping under the bed and disappearing into the shadows, just as the marshal's fist hammered on the door again, harder this time. Ruslan, I know you're in there. I saw the smoke from your chimney. Taking a deep breath to steady her trembling hands, Ruslan walked to the door, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She lifted the heavy bar, the scraping sound unnaturally loud in the tense silence, and pulled the door open just wide enough to slip through, closing it immediately behind her. She wanted to keep his eyes out of her home for as long as possible. She faced him on the porch, squinting against the morning sun. Marshal, to what do I owe the early visit? Marshal John Cartwright was a man carved from the hard Texas landscape. He was tall and lean, with a face that looked like it had been tanned and cured by a relentless sun. His eyes, the color of a washed-out sky, were his most formidable feature. They missed nothing, and gave away even less. He pushed his hat back on his head, his gaze sweeping past her to the closed door, then back to her face. Heard a shot yesterday afternoon, he said, his voice a low drawl. A single blast from a shotgun. Sounded like it came from this direction. Figured I'd ride out, make sure everything was in order. Coyotes, Ruslan said, her voice a little too tight. She forced a casual shrug. Getting bold. Came after the chickens. It was a plausible lie, a common enough occurrence. Cartwright nodded slowly, but his eyes never left hers. Just coyotes, you say? He gestured with his chin toward the porch steps. You set out a mighty fine meal for a coyote, Ruslan. A bowl, a cup, even a basin for him to wash his face. Ruslan's blood went cold. The evidence of her kindness was laid bare. I was cleaning up. Must have left them out. The lie was feeble, and she knew it. And the footprints, he continued, his voice relentless. He pointed to the dust near the steps where Taco's small bare prints were clear as day, alongside her own boot marks. Chicken's been running around barefoot now. She had no answer for that. The silence stretched thick with accusation. She could feel the boy's presence behind the door, a silent, terrified weight. She imagined him under the bed, holding his breath, listening to every word. Let me see inside, Ruslan, Cartwright said. It wasn't a request. There's no need, Marshal. I'm fine. Everything is fine. The people in Prairie Creek pay me to make sure of that. They're spooked. There's been talk. A small Comanche hunting party was spotted 2 days ago north of here near the Brazos. They're off the reservation. That makes them hostiles. His eyes narrowed. They were seen with a child, a boy. Ruslan felt the trap closing. He knew. He didn't just suspect. He knew. Her denial was useless. With a sigh of resignation that seemed to drain the strength from her body, she turned and opened the door, stepping back to let him pass. Cartwright entered the small home, his large frame seeming to shrink the space. His eyes scanned the room, lingering on the single table, set for one, the untouched blanket in the corner, and finally the bed. He walked over to it, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He didn't need to look underneath. He knew what he would find. He looked at Ruslan, a flicker of something disappointment, maybe even pity in his cold eyes. "You know the penalty for harboring a hostile, Ruslan," he said quietly. "It's seen as giving aid and comfort to the enemy. It's treason." "He's not a hostile," she shot back, her fear giving way to a surge of defiance. "He's a child. He was lost. Coyotes had him surrounded and dueled. Was I supposed to let them tear him apart? That's the law of the prairie. Sometimes it's cruel," Cartwright countered. "The law of man is what keeps us from becoming savages ourselves, and our law says they are not welcome on this land." He bent down, and for a heart-stopping moment, Ruslan thought he was going to drag the boy out. Instead, he just lifted the edge of the quilt, peering into the darkness. Ruslan couldn't see Taco, but she could feel his terror radiating from under the bed. Cartwright let the quilt fall. He straightened up and turned to her, his face an unreadable mask. "Get your bonnet, Ruslan. You're coming with me." "What about the boy?" she asked, her voice trembling. "He's evidence," the marshal said grimly. "He's coming too. We'll take him to the fort. The army can deal with him." Ruslan knew what that meant. Fort Richardson had no provision for Comanche children. He would be imprisoned, forgotten, or worse. It was a death sentence of a different kind. As she reached for her bonnet, a small sound no louder than a mouse's squeak came from under the bed, a tiny muffled sob of pure terror. Cartwright's head snapped toward the sound. A grim satisfaction settled on his features. The final proof. He had her. He had the boy. The law was satisfied. He took a step toward the bed, intending to end the charade, but before he could move, Ruslan did something that surprised them both. She stepped between him and the bed, her body a shield. In her hand, she held the iron skillet from the stove. It wasn't a weapon, not really, but her stance was unmistakable. "You'll not touch him," she said, her voice low and shaking, but laced with iron. Marshal Cartwright looked at her, then at the skillet, and then back at her face. He saw not a frightened widow, but a she-bear defending her cub. And for the first time since he had arrived, a flicker of uncertainty entered his cold, calculating eyes. He had come to enforce the law, but he had found something far more complicated and dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose. The standoff lasted for a full minute, the silence in the sod house thick enough to choke on. The only sound was the frantic ticking of the clock on the mantel, each tick a hammer blow against the tension. Ruslan stood firm, the heavy iron skillet held ready, her knuckles white. Marshal Cartwright watched her, his expression shifting from grim certainty to a kind of grudging respect. He was a man who understood defiance. He lived by it. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hands, palms open. It was not a gesture of surrender, but a signal for a parley. "Put the skillet down, Ruslan," he said, his voice calm, reasonable. "Let's not do anything foolish. I'm not your enemy here." "You mean to take him to the fort," she stated, her voice unwavering. "That makes you his enemy, and that makes you mine." Cartwright let out a long, weary sigh, the sound of a man burdened by complexities he'd rather not deal with. "It's not that simple. I told you I was tracking a war party. It wasn't just talk. He walked over to her small table and pulled out a chair, sitting down as if he planned to stay for dinner. That group seen up by the Brazos, it wasn't some small hunting party. It was a scout for a much larger group, a war band led by a man they call Peter Nokona's ghost. The name sent a chill down Ruslan's spine. Peter Nokona had been a legendary ferocious chief. His ghost was said to be his son, Quanah Parker. But some whispered it was a warrior, even more ruthless a man, who raided not for horses or glory, but for revenge. They hit the Stevens homestead 3 days ago. Cartwright continued, his voice dropping low. Killed old man Stevens and his wife. Took their horses, burned the cabin to the ground. They're moving fast and they're moving with a purpose. I've been tracking them, but they ride like the wind and leave a cold trail. He leaned forward, his pale eyes pinning her to the spot. And then I hear a shotgun blast from your place, and I find you harboring a Comanche child, a boy separated from his people who are cutting a bloody swath across this territory. He let the pieces connect in the air between them. Don't you see Ruslan? That boy is the key. They're not just raiding. They're looking for him. Ruslan felt the skillet grow heavy in her hand. The situation was shifting, twisting into a shape she could no longer comprehend. She wasn't just sheltering a lost child. She was caught in the middle of a manhunt. What do you want? She asked, lowering the skillet but not setting it down. I want the men who killed the Stevens family. Cartwright said, his voice hard as iron. I want to stop them before they hit another homestead, before more people die. That boy, he's our only chance. What do you mean? She asked, though a dreadful understanding was already dawning. He's bait. He's a beacon, Cartwright corrected, though it meant the same thing. His father or his uncle, whoever leads that band, will not leave this territory without him. Sooner or later, they'll come here. They'll have to. The horror of his proposal washed over her. He wanted to use Taco, this small, terrified child, to lure a war party into an ambush. He wanted to turn her act of mercy into an act of betrayal. No, she said, the word coming out as a strangled whisper. Absolutely not. I won't do it. You don't have a choice, Cartwright said flatly. Here are your options. Option 1. I arrest you for harboring a hostile. I take the boy to Fort Richardson, where he'll be locked in a cage until he dies of misery or sickness. And I'll be back on the trail hunting a ghost, and more people like the Stevens will probably die. Option 2. You and I play this out. We wait. When they show up, I'll be here to meet them. I've already sent word for a small company of rangers from Prairie Creek. They'll be here by tomorrow evening, hiding in the arroyo. We'll have the element of surprise. You want a bloodbath on my doorstep, she said, her voice filled with revulsion. I want to end this, he countered, his frustration evident. I want to go back to a world where a woman like you doesn't have to stand guard with a skillet because she's afraid of who might be outside. This is the only way. He stood up, his towering frame once again dominating the room. The choice is yours, Ruslan, but you're not just choosing for yourself or for that boy. You're choosing for every settler in a 50-mile radius. He had trapped her in a cage of logic and fear. Every instinct screamed at her to protect Taco, to refuse this monstrous plan. But the image of the burned Stevens homestead, of more families suffering that fate, haunted her. Cartwright was right. She wasn't just choosing for herself. She looked toward the bed where the boy was hidden. She had saved him from Coyotes, only to lead him into a trap set by men. What was the difference if I do this? She said, slowly, the words tasting like poison. If I agree, you have to promise me something. The boy. Taco. He is not to be harmed. No matter what happens, he is to be protected. Cartwright considered this for a moment. He was a pragmatist, not a monster. The boy was only useful to him alive. You have my word. The boy will not be harmed. We just want the warriors. Ruslan finally set the skillet down on the table with a heavy thud. It felt like she was laying down her own soul. What do we do now? We wait, the marshal said. We act normal. You go about your chores. You feed the boy. You make it look like nothing is wrong. Because they are out there, and I guarantee you they are watching. He walked to the door and paused his hand on the latch. And Ruslan, he said without turning around. Try not to get too attached. He left, closing the door behind him, and Ruslan was alone again in the silence of her home. But it was a different silence now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of her choice, the presence of the hidden child, and the terrible anticipation of what was coming. She walked to the bed and knelt, pulling back the quilt. Two hot, dark eyes stared back at her from the shadows. They were no longer filled with just terror, but with a new, dawning awareness. He had heard it all. He understood. And in his eyes, Ruslan saw the first flicker of a betrayal that wasn't even his own. The next 2 days passed in a haze of surreal domesticity, stretched taut over a framework of sheer terror. An uneasy and unspoken truce formed between the 3 inhabitants of the sod house. Marshal Cartwright, true to his word, did not stay. He made a show of riding off toward the east, only to double back under the cover of a small ravine and set up a hidden camp with his horse in a dense thicket of mesquite about a half-mile away. From there he could watch the homestead without being seen. Ruslan knew he was there. His presence was a constant invisible pressure. Inside the house, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken things. Taco, who had heard and understood more than Ruslan, had given him credit for no longer saw her as a simple savior. He saw her now as a captor, a partner to the grim-faced man who smelled of danger. He was wary, his movements cautious, his eyes holding a new, deeper sadness. Yet a child's need for connection is a powerful thing. The long, silent hours had to be filled. On the second day, Ruslan was mending one of Michael's old shirts, her fingers clumsy with tension. Taco sat in his usual corner watching her. He then got up and went to the small pouch he had retrieved from the arroyo, the only possession he had. From it, he took fit, smooth, flat stones. He came over to the table, and with a solemnity that was almost ceremonial, began a game. He would toss one stone in the air, and before it landed, try to scoop up the others from the table. He was deft and quick, his small hands a blur of motion. After watching him for some time, Ruslan put down her sewing. She tried to emulate his movements, but her fingers were stiff and awkward. The stones clattered uselessly on the table. A tiny, fleeting smile touched Taco's lips. It was the first time she had seen him smile, and it struck her with the force of a physical blow. He gently rearranged her fingers on the stones, showing her the proper technique. They didn't speak a word, but in that small moment of shared activity, a fragile bridge was built across the chasm of fear and language that separated them. Later that afternoon, as she kneaded dough for bread, she pointed to the water barrel. "Water," she said, enunciating the word clearly. Taco watched her lips, then looked at the barrel. He said a word in his own tongue, soft and guttural. Tuna. Water, Ruslan repeated. Waiter. He mimicked his pronunciation, careful and strange. Tuna. She tried mangling the sound. This time he laughed. A real, genuine child's laugh that filled the small, tense house with a warmth it hadn't known in over a year. The sound was so precious, so achingly normal, that it brought tears to Ruslan's eyes. She turned away quickly so he wouldn't see. Cartwright was right. She was getting attached. But the idyllic moments were fleeting, shattered by constant reminders of the approaching storm. As promised, the Rangers arrived. Ruslan didn't see them, but she knew. She saw Cartwright ride out to meet them, a silent, grim-faced posse that disappeared into the arroyo, where the Coyotes had first cornered Taco. Their presence was a cancer on the land, a promise of violence hidden beneath the golden grass. The Comanche were watching too. The signs were subtle, easily missed by an untrained eye, but terrifyingly clear to Ruslan, whose senses were now honed to a razor's edge. On the morning of the third day, she found a single hawk's feather, its tip painted red, tied to the top rail of her chicken coop with a piece of sinew. It hadn't been there the day before. It was a marker, a message. We see you. We know he is here. Later she went to the well to draw water. A small, deliberate pattern of colored stones, one red, two black, one white, had been placed on the well's stone lid. It was a language she didn't understand, but she felt its meaning in her bones. It felt like a clock counting down. She told Cartwright about the signs when he crept to the house after nightfall for a hushed, whispered conference. They're testing us, he said, his eyes scanning the dark prairie. They're confirming the boy is still here. They're being cautious. That means the leader is smart. This won't be a reckless charge. He looked at her, his face haggard in the moonlight. How's the boy? He's terrified, Ruslan answered sharply. And he's smart. He knows he's being used. Good, Cartwright said, with a brutal pragmatism that chilled her. Fear will keep him quiet. That night, Ruslan couldn't sleep. She lay on her bed, the shotgun beside her, listening to the sounds of the prairie, the whisper of the wind, the distant howl of a lone wolf, the soft breathing of the boy sleeping in the corner. He had the blanket she had given him, pulled up to his chin, a small, trusting gesture that tore at her heart. She was his protector and his jailer, his only comfort and his greatest betrayer. The choice she had made seemed simple in the face of Cartwright's logic, but living with its consequences was a slow, grinding torment. She was caught between two worlds belonging to neither. To the Rangers hidden in the arroyo, she was a necessary accomplice. To the silent watchers on the plains, she was a kidnapper. And to the boy sleeping in her home, she was a monster in the guise of a friend. She rose from her bed and went to the shuttered window, peering through the small crack. The moon was high and full, bathing the prairie in a ghostly silver light. The land looked beautiful, peaceful, serene. But it was a lie. The peace was a mask. Underneath the ground was humming with anticipation, coiled like a snake ready to strike. The whispers on the wind had ceased. Now, there was only a dead, watchful silence. The kind of silence that comes right before the thunder. They were coming. She knew it as surely as she knew her own name. They were coming soon. They came not with the thunder of a charge, but with the silent, inexorable creep of the dawn. Ruslan was awake to see it a sleepless sentinel at her window. One moment, the prairie was empty, a canvas of grey and silver. The next, they were there. Figures on horseback, materializing from the folds of the land, as if born from the earth itself. It was not a small party. It was a line of riders that stretched across the horizon, a living, breathing wall of silent, determined men silhouetted against the rising sun. 100, at least. An army. They did not whoop or yell. They simply advanced their ponies, moving at a steady, deliberate walk that consumed the ground between them and the homestead. The faint jingle of bridles, the soft thud of unshod hooves on the dry earth. These were the only sounds in the vast stillness. It was a display of disciplined power, a force of nature that made the small sod house seem fragile and absurdly defiant. Ruslan's breath caught in her throat. She glanced over at Taco. He was awake, pressed against the wall, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a dawning fierce pride. He knew. This was his family. His people. A sharp whistle cut through the air, Cartwright's signal from his hiding place. The trap was set. The rangers in the arroyo would be readying their rifles, their hearts pounding with the brutal excitement that precedes a battle. The riders stopped about 200 yards from the house, fanning out in a wide semicircle that sealed the homestead in a crescent of lances and rifles. Then one rider detached himself from the line and rode forward alone. He was a man of impressive stature, his authority radiating from him like heat from a fire. He wore a magnificent headdress of eagle feathers that trailed down his back, and his chest was adorned with a polished bone breastplate that gleamed in the new morning sun. His face was stern and noble, etched with the deep lines of grief and command. He carried no rifle, only a single feather-adorned lance, holding it not as a weapon, but as a staff of office. He guided his powerful paint horse with his knees, his hands resting on his thighs, a picture of absolute control. He stopped 50 yards from the porch, his dark, penetrating eyes fixed on the door. He did not need an introduction. Ruslan knew who he was. This was the grieving father. This was the leader of the 100 riders. The chief raised his hand palm open in the universal sign of parley. Then he spoke, his voice deep and resonant, a sound that carried across the prairie like the roll of distant thunder. He did not speak English. He spoke in the flowing, guttural cadence of his people, a speech filled with anguish and command. Inside the house, Taco began to tremble uncontrollably. He whimpered his father's name. Papa! A sound so filled with longing and despair that it shattered Ruslan's heart. The chief spoke again, his voice rising a desperate plea now woven through the authority. Ruslan knew this was the moment. Cartwright was waiting for her signal for her to confirm this was the leader. This was the moment she was supposed to complete her monstrous bargain. But looking from the magnificent grieving man outside to the terrified child inside, she could not see warriors and settlers, hostiles and victims. She saw only a father and a son, separated by a world of violence and misunderstanding. "Don't shoot," she whispered a prayer to a god she wasn't sure was listening. "Please don't shoot." In that instant, she made a decision. It was not born of logic or strategy, but from a place deeper than fear. She laid her shotgun on the table, a clear sign to Taco that she was surrendering. Then she looked at him, her eyes pleading for him to understand. She pointed to the door. "Go," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Go to your father." Taco stared at her, his dark eyes wide with disbelief. He looked at the door, then back at her, searching her face. He saw the truth there. This was not a trick. With a cry that was half sob, half shout, he scrambled to his feet. He fumbled with the heavy bar on the door, his small hands struggling with its weight. Ruslan rushed to help him, lifting it free. The boy burst out onto the porch, blinking in the bright sunlight. "Papa!" he cried out in his own language, a sound of pure joy. The chief's stern facade broke. A look of profound, agonizing relief washed over his face. He let out a great cry and urged his horse forward. At the same time, Taco scrambled off the porch and ran across the dusty ground, his small legs pumping as fast as they could. It was then that the first shot rang out. It wasn't from Cartwright. It was from the arroyo. A young, nervous ranger, seeing the chief charge forward and the boy run out, must have panicked. The bullet kicked up dust just a few feet from Taco. The effect was instantaneous. The silent, disciplined line of warriors erupted. 100 voices joined in a single, terrifying war cry. 100 rifles were leveled. "Hold your fire, damn you, hold your fire!" Cartwright's voice roared from the thicket. But it was too late. The peace was broken. The promise of violence was fulfilled. The chief reacted with incredible speed. He wheeled his horse, placing himself between the shooter and his son. In one fluid motion, he swept down, scooping the boy up from the ground and onto the horse in front of him. He held him tight, shielding him with his own body, his face a mask of cold fury. He had come in peace and had been met with treachery. But then something extraordinary happened. Taco, held safely in his father's arms, turned and looked back at Ruslan. He had seen what she did. He had seen her put down her gun, open the door. He shouted something to his father, his small voice cutting through the tense silence. He pointed not at the arroyo, but at Ruslan. He spoke again, his words earnest and insistent. The chief's gaze shifted from the arroyo to Ruslan, standing alone and unarmed on her porch. He listened to his son's words. The fury in his eyes slowly subsided, replaced by confusion, and then a dawning understanding. He looked at the shotgun, clearly visible through the open doorway. He looked at her empty hands, at the terrified but resolute expression on her face. With regal authority, he raised his lance high in the air. The war cries of his men died in their throats. He looked at Ruslan one last time and gave her a single sharp nod. It was not friendship or forgiveness. It was acknowledgement, a sign of respect from one warrior to another. Then he turned his horse, and with his son held securely before him, he began to ride away. The 100 riders fell into formation behind him and melted back into the prairie, disappearing as silently as they had arrived. The silence after the riders departed was broken by Marshal Cartwright stomping up to the porch, his face a thundercloud. "Do you know what you've done?" he roared. "I had them trapped. We could have ended this." "That wasn't Quanah Parker," Ruslan said quietly. "And he came for his son, not a fight. You didn't have them. They had you. You chose them over us. That's treason." Cartwright spat. Ruslan met his gaze without flinching. "Then hang me. I did what was right. I saved a child from being torn apart by coyotes, and then again from men." Her simple, stubborn humanity seemed to drain the anger from him, leaving only weariness. "The official report will say they were a superior force that evaded our trap. There will be no mention of a boy, or you," he said gruffly. "But don't expect thanks. Your neighbors won't forget you let 100 warriors ride away." He was right. A chill settled over her life. In Prairie Creek, whispers followed her, and doors seemed to close. She was an outcast, her act of compassion seen as a dangerous madness in a world defined by fear. She retreated into the solitude of her homestead. The work was hard, and the loneliness profound, but her view of the prairie had changed. It was no longer an enemy, but a shared space full of stories. One cool autumn morning, she found a gift on her porch, a magnificent soft buffalo robe, and tucked inside a pair of intricately beaded moccasins. There was no note, but she knew. Wrapping the robe around her shoulders, she felt its warmth seep into her bones. She was still alone, still an outcast, but not without hope. She had faced the law of the prairie and the law of man, and had chosen a harder, different path. Looking to the horizon, she felt for the first time since Michael's death that she was part of the vast land, a solitary thread in a grand tapestry. The price of her compassion was high, but in the quiet of her heart, she knew she would pay it again. Ruslan O'Malley's story is not one of a great battle or a famous treaty. It's a quiet story of a choice that reminds us that history is not just made by generals and politicians, but in the hearts of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. She didn't end a war, but she refused to be a part of it. She proved that even in the most brutal of times, a single act of compassion can send ripples of change across the plains, and that the courage to save one life is sometimes the greatest courage of all. What would you have done in her place? Let us know in the comments below. If this story of the untamed West resonated with you, please give this video a like. Share it with someone who appreciates tales of courage and conviction, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more true stories from the pages of history. Thank you for watching.